But a lot of people have been comparing this Caysen Allison case to the Carmelo Anthony case. Why? Because he is a teenager who ended up getting into a fight in the school bathroom. He in himself had a knife, stabbed the student. He ultimately died. And he went for the self defense case as well. But he was given ultimately 10 years instead of just like Carmelo Anthony, 35. Now, a lot of people are comparing this because, of course, he's a white man, a white student, and then Carmelo Anthony was a black student. But let's get over into this and just figure out a breakdown of what exactly the case was about.
Story tonight, former Belton High student Caysen Allison was sentenced today to the maximum 10 years in prison for the fatal stabbing of fellow student Joe Ramirez.
This comes after a jury found Allison guilty of criminally negligent homicide, and a judge added a deadly weapon enhancement to his potential sentence. 6 News reporter Sydney Walker was in the courtroom for today's sentencing and has the latest.
Nearly 3 years after Joe Ramirez died, the man who stabbed him will spend a decade behind bars. Judge Wade Faulkner sentenced Allison to 10 years in confinement in the institutional division. This comes after 9 witnesses testified, including the mothers of both Ramirez and Allison, school employees who responded to the stabbing, and Allison's therapist. 3 Belton ISD staff members described lasting trauma from that day: sleepless nights, anxiety, and PTSD. One teacher said the incident forced her into medical retirement. Joe's family tearfully shared how his loss has changed their lives and say they haven't received true justice. The defense presented Allison's parents and counselor, who testified about his growth and remorse over 3 years of therapy, revealing that Allison is now a father. Defense attorney Boyd warned that prison would be a, quote, death sentence for his client and asked for just 2 years. But prosecutors successfully argued for the maximum, calling Ramirez's death, quote, entirely avoidable. When Faulkner announced the 10-year sentence, Ramirez's family erupted in applause and cheers. The judge quickly restored order while Allison's family sat in stunned silence. Following the sentencing, Ramirez's mother took the stand, looked Allison in the eye, and said, quote, "You get this measly 10-year sentence while I'm serving a life sentence without my son." The DA's office said, quote, "They hope today's verdict can allow Joe's family and our community to move forward."
Now, a lot of people are comparing these two cases. I did not know that he was a father, so I'm assuming, because they said 3 years, because it took 3 years for them to get to this final sentencing in this case. So in that time, he became a father? Absolutely crazy. But let's go over into the breakdown of this actual case and see how it differed from the Carmelo Anthony case. So as we know, he was the trial for Caysen Allison focused on the May 3rd, 2022 fatal stabbing of the 18-year-old Joe Ramirez in the restroom of the Belton High School. So the trial took place in April 2025. So on April 29th, the jury rejected the murder manslaughter charges instead of convicting Allison, instead convicting him of criminal negligent homicide. Though a state jail felony normally carries a maximum 2 years, the judge ended up applying a deadly weapons enhancement. So he could have gotten, if he didn't have that deadly weapon enhancement, he would have only gotten 2 years. So let's go through the breakdown. So the prosecution's point that they made in this case, they intended, the state highlighted that Ramirez was stabbed multiple times across his chest, back, legs, and arms, which they argued showed an intent to kill rather than a simple act of protection. So as we know in the Carmelo Anthony case, he ended up stabbing him one time in the heart. So they also said that they presented text messages and social media evidence in indicating that Allison had aggressively planned the fight and wanted to put Ramirez on life support. So after the stabbing, he ended up fleeing the school and was recorded trying to arrange a safe house in Waco to evade police. So the defense's points. The defense portrayed Allison as an 18-year-old trapped in a small bathroom facing a group of boys. They noted that as Allison explicitly stated, "I'm not fighting in school, I just want to graduate." So yes, they did talk about how the witnesses stated he didn't want to fight in the bathroom. They presented evidence that Ramirez's group had pulled a weapon on Allison at an after prom party prior to the incident, establishing the baseline valid need of fear. And then the defense also heavily criticized the police department, noting that the detectives reviewed less than 1 hour of the 18 terabytes of available school video footage. They also noted police delayed medical attention for Allison's own head injuries. So the ended up legal outcome that happened. So legal experts observed and evaluated this case based on the 3 predicted outcomes. We ended up having the murder conviction, the fully acquitted, and they ended up going up with the compromise verdict, basically a lesser charge like manslaughter or criminal negligent homicide, which ultimately happened. The legal expert noted that the verdict proved that the jury believed Allison's fear was real, but his use of a knife grossed a deviation from what a reasonable person would do. So here's a good point of what the witnesses said on the stand during this case. So we got Allison's friend. He testified that he and Allison tried to leave the restroom, but Ramirez and his friends blocked them. He witnessed Ramirez sucker punch Allison, which triggered a chaotic scuffle where he had to end up fighting Ramirez's stepbrother. So we got Ramirez's stepbrother. He recounts the chaotic bathroom fight on a cross-examination. The defense used police body cam footage to show his initially hid the details from police, claiming the fight was just over a girl at prom. And then we got the girl, of course, in question. She provided a damning evidence about Allison, testifying that he sent her a text message saying he's going to stomp his head in and leave his jaw dangling. And then we also have the testify from the teacher. He testified to breaking up the scuffle outside of the bathroom where the stepbrother was chasing Allison. He ended up telling that he stabbed his brother. Then we got the detective. He's faced heavy questioning from the defense regarding the flawed timeline on the interrogation tapes, and they admitted that the leadership had not went over and reviewed the 18 terabytes of school footage. Then we know officer, he presented audio footage where Allison was trying to flee. And then the medical examiner provided details of the cause of death, mapping out all his injuries. So the character witnesses, we had the mother, and both mothers ended up talking. Now I did have a question: what was difference between these 2 cases? So as we know, Karmelo Anthony case ended where he was convicted of murder, not manslaughter or anything else like that, but murder, and sentenced to 35 years. So the main differences between this was the defense was the same. They both was providing self-defense. And the key witnesses, let's see, the friends and text messages that one has. So it was a weird case. So that's why a lot of people are comparing these 2. And ultimately, one ended up getting 10 years of the applied maximum sentence. And then one ended up getting 35 years, eligible for parole after serving half. So Allison's defense, so they successfully was able to argue the scenario, basically saying that Allison was physically cornered in a confined bathroom, faced multiple individuals, and sustained a documented head injury from being sucker punched before drawing the knife. And then we know that Anthony's legal defense tried to argue, saying that he was confronted by a physically larger member of the opposing track team. However, prosecutor successfully countered that Anthony escalated a minor verbal dispute under the tent into him pulling out a folding knife. As the state prosecutor says, you don't get to meet a shove with a stab. So I mean, this is basically what everybody is comparing. They're saying that because Caysen, Allison was white and Karmelo Anthony was black, and then just the jury makeup in general, that they ended up getting 2 separate charges for being basically the same thing. But there is some differences that I am seeing. Now tell me if I'm wrong, but just the simple fact that it sounds like witnesses have stated that Allison wasn't able to leave the bathroom. That is a big difference right there, is not being able to leave the bathroom. They physically stopped him from moving, leaving, and forced him to fight. That is what witnesses claim. They would claim that he did not want to fight. But in Karmelo Anthony's case, he was asked to leave. So that's completely different. He was asked to leave and could have left, but he stayed. So that is the biggest main differences I'm seeing from this case. But I wonder if there's any difference. I don't think it makes a difference, but some do. Some think it does. Was the jury makeup in the Caysen Allison case? Yes, the basic structure of the demographic makeup of the jury for the trial. So with 12 members, of course, the panel was comprised of 7 men, 6 women. According to the observer data, the local public record first panel were racially diverse, consisting of 8 black jurors, 2 Hispanic jurors, 1 white juror, and 1 juror of Native American descent. So in this case, he was a white man. So they had 1 juror, 1 white juror on this case, and Anthony had 0 black jurors on the case. Now, do you think that matters? It's This is the case that everybody's comparing to the Karmelo Anthony case. I think I do see some key differences. Like I said, in the Karmelo Anthony case, I was expecting him to maybe get 20 years. But do you think that in terms of this case, he should have gotten more time than the 10 years, the Allison? Or do you think everything played out the way it should be? That is what I wanted to talk about today, because I've been seeing a lot of this talk on social media. Now, the question is, what do you think? Do you think Karmelo Anthony got more time than he should have? Because no matter what you think, I believe a reasonable person would say that Karmelo Anthony deserved to go to prison for what he did. Now, the time amount ranges, just depend on how you see it, but I think a reasonable person would understand that he needs to go to prison. Same thing with this case. I think a reasonable person would see, okay, he needs to go to prison. No matter what, they still ended up bringing a knife to ultimately a fist fight. Now, one was cornered in a bathroom and couldn't leave. One could leave. So maybe that is where the differences come from and not the race factor at all. But let me know your thoughts on that situation, because a lot of people have been talking about that, and I want to see what y'all opinions are.